It's the week ending Saturday the 13th of November, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the world's two biggest polluters, China and the United States, signing an agreement to cut emissions at COP26. Conservative MP Sir Geoffrey Cox denying he broke parliamentary rules by carrying out paid legal work in his House of Commons office, and Walkers apologising for a crisp shortage. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's Julia O'Driscoll and Mr. Joe Evans. And from Aleppo via London, now in Hong Kong, it can only be Abdulwahab Tahan. Okay, Joe, you are up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Has anybody seen the Vice President?
And the more her polls shrunk, the more she shrunk. And the less now they're pushing her aside. Yeah. I would say, come on, Kamala, wake up, get in there. You could do this. She is being canceled by the right-wing woke mob.
She's being She is being canceled by the West Wing. It's the West Wing.
Well, maybe both.
A lively clip from The Five on Fox News earlier this week. Joe, there were a lot of words to unpick in those few short seconds, but what's the story?
Yes, so what that panel of very excited people were discussing was a new poll that found that Kamala Harris, the Vice President's approval rating, has reached a historic low for this stage of an administration. It's the lowest of any Vice President in at least 50 years, and her ranking has sank to 27.8%.
Okay, so give us an idea of the competitors. Who's been nearly as low as that in the polls, Vice President-wise?
So there is actually no Vice President that has ever been this unpopular at this stage of administration. The closest would be people like Dick Cheney, who is obviously very famous for his involvement in the Iraq War. But it obviously comes as a massive blow to Harris, who was elected on a sort of massive wave of goodwill. She was a first of her kind, the first black female vice president and also first Asian American vice president. And it's very interesting that over the last few months, in the context of a wider fall in the polls for the Biden administration, Harris seems to be suffering even more than the president.
So, Julia, why do you think there's been such a huge fall from grace?
I think there's quite a few factors at play here. One being that Harris has quite a lot on her plate from Biden, particularly unpopular tasks, sorting out the situation at the US-Mexico border, as well as voter suppression, which are regarded as really difficult tasks to kind of work through. So already she's facing an uphill battle on that front. But I think there's also an issue around her image. People don't really know what she stands for. And a former White House staffer told Sky News exactly that this week, that she hasn't really found an image for herself. She doesn't know how to reimagine herself in the public's eye. And so it's unclear how she's going to gain further public support.
So tensions at the border. If only we had a refugee in the room. Abdul. She's been put in charge of stemming migration at America's southern border. Some say that is frankly an impossible brief, and also seems to run counter, really, to her real feelings and all the ways that she's campaigned in the years up to this point.
It was completely difficult and job that she was put in. We've seen the images coming from the borders. We've seen how people were chased on horses and how that reminded a lot of people of the dark days of slavery. So this was on one hand. On the other hand, I would feel a little bit, not really concerned about this all situation, because at the end of the day, this is an official poll. This is just numbers. These are going to go up and down. We've seen how disapproval rates went down when Trump was president, and then he was really competing for presidency again. So what do these numbers do? Do these numbers mean that she's going to step down or resignate? No, and these are not going to really change anything.
Well, that's very similar to what the Democrats and the spokespeople are saying publicly, Joe, but it can't be how they're really feeling. I mean, if these polls look different, if it looked like she had a 60% approval rating, the drum would continue beating for her to stand to be president next time round.
Absolutely, and there are Democratic strategists already starting to suggest that the party needs to be slightly more open-minded when it comes to selecting its candidate for 2024. It's worth noting that if you think back to the party's primaries in 2020, she also dropped out due to lack of funds, which for a California senator with a high public profile, that's quite an achievement, really, to run out of funds in the primary stage of the selection for a candidate. Obviously, the threat of Trump also hangs over all of this. Absent of legal or health troubles, he does look quite likely to be the Republican candidate again. He leads in all the polls. There is really kind of no popular GOP candidate that the party's managed to rally behind in such a way as to stop Trump being able to run again. And there is a concern that Harris, former public prosecutor, will be very easily cast by someone like Trump as a coastal elite, an untrustworthy radical. And I think that this is starting to concern the Democrats, because she was sort of positioned as someone that would very easily take over from Biden, who has suggested multiple times that he's a one-term president.
Yeah, he suggested that, Julia, but you do wonder whether the people in his team, now he's installed and is the president, might quite like to throw Kamala Harris under the bus and give him the chance to stand again. Power does that to people, doesn't it?
I think they would have quite a tough job doing so, because actually this poll also had some quite interesting implications for Biden's popularity rating. So 1,000 people were asked their opinion, and 59% said that they disapprove of Biden compared to 51% of Harris. So more people disapprove of Biden than Harris. What's interesting is that 21% of people said that they were undecided about how they felt about Harris, whether they approve or disapprove, compared to 3% of Biden. So more people have already made up their minds against Biden, whereas Harris still has about 1 in 5 people to win over. So there is real space here for her to gain more public support, and there's potential that she could and put herself forward as a front runner. It's just going to really depend how she responds to these kind of results and what's happening in the media as a result.
Yeah, and Abdul, Biden's unpopularity and Harris's unpopularity aren't discussed much in Britain, are they? It reminds me a bit of when Obama was president, and I went to the United States, and I was quite shocked to encounter Americans, including Democrat voting Americans, who were quite happy to say how unhappy they were with him as their president. And in Europe, he'd always been presented as a kind of superhero. I feel like as much as Kamala Harris has been discussed, it's been like, oh, isn't it incredible, how she's come from this humble background and now she's the vice president. And it's almost like Europe hasn't noticed that a lot of America don't like who's running the country at the moment.
A lot of Americans don't like who's running the country at the moment, but it's at the end of the day, people are going to either vote for the Democrats or for the Republican. We saw that happen in last week when there was a by-elections in New Jersey, where Steve Sweeney, who is a senator, Democrat, lost his seat after 20 years of being a senator to a truck driver who only raised $7,000. So at the end of the day, it's people who are deciding to vote for whoever, not based on their record, but based on their affiliation and based on their background. So even if the disapprovals are very, very high, at the end of the day, who do you want to be in the office, this one or that one? A friend of mine who was a refugee and became a British citizen during the election voted for the Tory, voted for the same people who don't want refugees in the country just because he doesn't like the Labours. So it could be one of these things that, based on the background, people would vote for their favorite candidate.
But it is going to define how the election might be fought, isn't it, Joe? Let's assume that Trump is the candidate, as Abdul just did then. Of course, we don't know that for the Republicans, but it's probably likely to be a Trumpian, if not him. There's going to be attack ads focused around Kamala Harris, isn't there? That's clear now.
Yeah, that's quite right. And, there already has been attack ads prior to the election last year. The difficulty, I think, for Harris is that she is suffering from a lack of visibility, which is, I think, kind of what Julie was alluding to earlier when she says that there's still 1 in 5 voters that actually just don't really know what she stands for. In the first 4 months of the Biden administration, she was appearing quite regularly with Biden, around 40 times. In October, that dropped to 8. She has got a very difficult portfolio. As Julia mentioned, she's been tasked with trying to handle illegal migration on America's southern border. And she's also been handed the job of trying to reduce what the Democrats describe as voter suppression, what the Republicans call voter registration. But given the 50-50 split of the Senate, that's near impossible as well. So that's going to be something she'll struggle to do. If you look actually at her schedule, she does quite a lot of events, but only a third of those have been open to the press, and the other ones are sort of hybrid events where you kind of get a pool spray, this thing where you can go and listen to her for 10 minutes and then the press have to get out, which is kind of useful as a thing for a vice president to do. They're very popular with VPs because they don't risk outshining the president, but it does also kind of begin to explain where this lack of visibility and a sort of lack of understanding of what she stands for comes from among voters. most vice presidents do slightly shrink into the role of being a VP. It's quite a common thing, save maybe Dick Cheney, who I mentioned earlier, who ran foreign policy and defence policy under George W. Bush. The challenge now for Harris is going to be whether, possibly not in the next 12 months or even the next 24 months, but certainly as you get close to 2024 and the primaries begin again, whether she can push herself out from Biden's shadow and whether she can cast herself as a successor to the role of sitting in the Oval Office.
Has the Biden administration slightly failed her, though, do you think, Julia? Because she will be present in the next election in whatever position. And you could argue that, I don't know, they almost had a duty to keep her away from the line of fire because of what she represents, as we talked about earlier, the first woman, the first Black American, the first South Asian American to be elected vice president. All those cards need to be played again next election as well. But I suppose, on the other hand, if you don't give her the difficult jobs, then that looks patronising too.
I don't think they do have a responsibility to shelter her from kind of the more thankless tasks. Being vice president is generally a bit of a thankless role. You have to take on the difficult tasks, and that just comes with the job. I don't think that Harris was under any illusion that wouldn't be the case. I think in some ways what is more difficult is what female politicians, particularly in the US, have come up against time and time again, which is that they are judged on a completely different set of standards and expectations to their male counterparts. The Jennifer Palmieri, who was the former White House communications director and worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign, was saying, kind of in response to Harris's unpopularity, that part of the problem is women are kind of judged on their past record and their credentials, whereas male candidates more often are judged on their potential. Part of which I think comes into the fact that, we can imagine seeing a young, up-and-coming politician speaking, you can kind of see whose footsteps politically he might follow in. There are comparisons you can kind of literally bring to mind visually. Whereas for women, it's an uphill battle, and particularly for Kamala Harris being a first woman to achieve so much in so many ways on race and in terms of gender as well. And so I think that's what's difficult here, is she's having to play to a different set of standards in terms of likability, but also being tough, showing people she's experienced, but also showing people she's got the potential to do more. And it's just not particularly fair at the end of the day.
Also, I don't know if you've seen, any of you, the attack that appears to be levelled at her. I spent a bit of time in anti-Kamala YouTube this morning about her laugh. There's been a lot of focus on the fact that she laughs when she's asked difficult questions.
Yeah, and there's also a suggestion the laugh is a slightly cackly laugh, isn't it? Which I think probably...
Yes, cackle is the phrase that Google auto-prompted me with.
Yeah, which I think probably relates back to exactly the point Julia was just making, that there is, I think, definitely just a sense that, and this isn't a US problem, that female politicians are judged differently.
Because cackle is what you might say about a witch.
Well, quite, and also just sort of finding the time to analyse the Vice President's laugh is probably not a particularly useful use of anybody's time.
Abdul, if you look at the data, though, as to the really big question, is she going to be the next president? The only vice president in modern times to be elected to succeed his boss was George H.W. Bush. There's not actually that many occasions when it's happened anyway.
No, it's not. But I think she was chosen because of her background. When Biden chose her, he chose her because of her background, because he knew that he can win a lot of support and will get the media attention, that she's the first Asian American, she's from poor background, and all these cards that she played. And that's exactly why he played her. But very quick point, I know I'm going back to the point of visibility. I think we're not used to have a lot of news about vice president or president, because in the last 4 years, Trump provided us with unlimited controversy every day. So we got used to seeing him and tweet his tweets. His tweets were, major news, firing people via Twitter. So now we're not seeing her a lot. This is a good thing for the country, I guess.
Yes, maybe more like actually service as normal. Okay, Abdul, you're up next after this. Okay, Abdul, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
When Turkey went banana?
In recent years, racism has become more common. Turkish people have started to look down on us and dislike us. We began to hear them saying, "Why don't you go home? Our government pays your salaries and rents your houses."
Ali Khatib, a Syrian who's now returned to Idlib from Turkey, speaking to Al Jazeera last month. Abdul, what's the story this week? As you hinted, it involves bananas.
Well, the situation is banana. in Turkey, where a vox pop, there's a Turkish guy who was just doing some vox pop, getting some Turkish people to talk and give them opinions. And two Turkish people were complaining about Syrian refugees. It's the same propaganda, coming into the country, stealing our jobs, getting all the benefit, getting a lot of money from the government. A woman said that we cannot really afford buying bananas, and Syrian refugees buy a lot of bananas.
Yes, I see Syrians in the bazaar buying kilograms of bananas. I myself cannot afford them, she said.
Yeah, so that's her quote. She couldn't really buy bananas. And again, all this propaganda that Syrian refugees receive a lot of money living in luxury. So Syrians, what they did on TikTok, they decided to post some videos and eating bananas just to make fun of, this interview. The Turkish authority took that as offense to Turkey and started clamping down on those people, including a Syrian journalist who talks about the daily situation for Syrians in Turkey. And then he was sent to a detention center, prepared to be deported back to Syria, where his life is in danger.
Because he'd done a video too in which he mockingly ate a banana.
That's correct. Luckily, the Turkish authority decided that he did not really offend the Turkish people, and he was set free 2 days ago.
Julia, what are the people in these banana videos being accused of when they're arrested?
So they're being accused of provocation and inciting hatred. This viral trend is basically being seen as a real political offence against the Turkish authorities, who are taking them incredibly seriously, which I think shows... the fact that the police are kind of involved and there are threats of deportation just shows how seriously it's kind of being believed that they are a real provocation of hatred.
And Joe, I saw one comment on Twitter from a Syrian who lives in Turkey trying to explain why this had been misunderstood. They said, "We are not mocking Turks, we're mocking racism. Economic deterioration affects us all." What do you think got lost in translation?
I think what got lost in translation is that the economic situation in Turkey is absolutely dire, and I don't think lots of Turks found it particularly funny that this person who was making a complaint about their economic situation was being mocked. Quite clearly, they shouldn't have made that point about their economic situation through blaming Syrian refugees for everything. Turkey's economy essentially is not working at the moment. Economic growth on paper looks great, but it hasn't translated into more jobs, meaning unemployment is increasing rapidly. And the bigger problem actually at the moment is that inflation reached around 20% in September, at the same time obviously causing the currency to lose value. Erdogan has also slashed interest rates when central banks around the world are increasing interest rates, which has caused another plunge in the value of the lira. And so essentially the country is in a terrible economic situation. And I think that part of the reason that so many Turks were provoked by this is because their situations are deteriorating. And of course, it's also a really useful argument for the government and officials to have, because it does distract from the fact that the gross domestic product of the country is collapsing and they are in a dire situation.
Yeah, and amongst the various visuals that were shared by people who were posting these banana videos were images of the Turkish lira with bananas in the middle instead of what normally appears on the paper currency. I mean, Abdul, to go back to the clip that kicked this whole banana viral thing off, the Turkish woman who said she was unemployed and used bananas as an example of what she could no longer afford. I mean, you say it's propaganda, but it was in the context of a piece asking whether having 3.6 million Syrians in the country was or wasn't affecting opportunities for Turks. And that is a reasonable question to ask, isn't it? And it's a reasonable answer for someone to say, if it's their experience, well, yes, I feel that migrants have taken away opportunities from me and my family.
It is totally free. If we were living in a free country where you can talk freely and you wouldn't be threatened to be deported if you respond to such a question. Like the responses that people posted on TikTok or online were also a reply to this question, but then they were threatened to be deported. 9 people were arrested. Luckily, they haven't been deported, which is great. And you cannot imagine the same thing happening in Europe. This is a reason why a lot of people go to Europe. When I was living in England, I did a lot of stand-ups and I made some jokes of the royal family. I was never threatened to be sent back to Syria over some silly jokes. And I was criticizing the royal family, right? Some people, regular people, citizens, repeating talking points of kind of a right-wing media that everything is bad because of the Syrian refugee and they're the scapegoat.
Scapegoating is interesting, isn't it, Julia? Because also, as Joe hinted at, it's perhaps perversely an advantage for the right-wing parties in Turkey to actually keep the Syrian refugees there, despite the talk of deportation, because then you do have something that they can unify against.
Yeah, worryingly, I do think that could also be the case. If we think about in Europe how refugees are being used more and more as a political weapon, looking to kind of the border between Belarus and Poland at the moment, we're seeing, migrants and refugees have been told to go to the border with the promise of gaining asylum in Europe when they get there. And that just isn't the case. And this has been seen as a move by the Belarusian government to kind of punish the EU for sanctions that it's taking against the government for human rights abuses. So I think it's really important to think about exactly that, how right-wing governments are using refugees for their own political aims.
Is it being blown slightly out of proportion in terms of the fears of most of those millions of migrants, though, Joe? Because most of them didn't post banana videos. I mean, obviously you shouldn't be arrested for satire, but for the millions that didn't, do you think they should worry they're going to be deported, that their families are going to be deported? Do you think those fears are justified?
I mean, the response to the banana video is the sort of slightly more ridiculous end of what is a rising anti-migrant sentiment in Turkey. Migrant protesters in Istanbul attacked houses and things like that in October after a rumour was spread that Syrian refugees had killed a Turkish teenager. It's also been exacerbated in the last few months by the arrival of lots of Afghans who are fleeing after the US and Allied withdrawal from Afghanistan. The UN estimates that Turkey currently holds the largest number of refugees worldwide. As you said, it's about 3.6 million Syrians and then the additional Afghans that are arriving now. Erdogan has warned Europe that essentially he's not going to be able to keep maintaining the deal that he struck with the European Union in 2015, where Turkey basically agreed to hold Syrian refugees in exchange for EU aid. And so I think that, as you say, the response to the banana video is definitely being it's a disproportionate response to what is, as Abdul said, quite clearly just a small joke being played at the expense of one woman who made a, slightly odd point about bananas. But it does come in the context of wider anti-migrant sentiment, and it does also raise fears, given the fact that we expect there to be huge displacement from Afghanistan over the coming months and maybe even coming years, given the Taliban have regained control of the country. It does raise concerns about how Europe and Turkey would potentially respond to another refugee crisis like the one seen in 2015.
I suppose, Abdul, if people do feel unsafe in Turkey, it's difficult to know where they can look. They're seeking refuge in Turkey. There isn't anywhere else for them to feel safer.
No, there's no. And I would say hundreds of thousands of people did not post banana jokes in reply because they knew once they post these things, they might be deported. A lot of people did not post, but in private discussions with some of my friends and family members who live there, they were telling me how scared they were. Pretty much every refugee I know have nightmares about being deported, whether even if you're living in Europe, if you're living in Turkey, if you're living in Asia, it doesn't matter. We all have this fear. Subconsciously, when we go to sleep, we have this kind of unified nightmare that you're deported. You're being deported. So when you see news in the country you're living in, and you cannot leave to any other place, if you want to go to Greece, you get arrested and sent back. So it's really difficult. It's a worrisome. It's not an easy situation, but you got to live with it until you become a Turkish citizen. And a number of them are on the path. Those who have a university degree can become Turkish citizens. So some of them will have a better life soon.
I think another important thing to note is that obviously in the EU, refugees do have a certain level of kind of safety and protection under the principle of non-refoulement. But in Turkey, a law was passed in 2018 that means that people who are applying for international protection can be deported if they're seen to be threatening public order or public health, which feels like an incredibly broad and unspecific kind of remit. And so I suppose, as Abdul was saying, the fact that kind of these viral videos that potentially seem a little bit odd and humorous to viewers who don't really realise the political implications actually do have real kind of worrying threats for not only the people who are getting their status questioned and they're being threatened with deportation correctly, it's the wider communities as well, and the ramifications, and what could be even kind of more curbs on their safety as well.
Yes, and as Abdul says about the nightmares that refugees will have about being deported home, it should be said that in the context of these Syrian refugees being deported back to Syria, this isn't an uncommon thing. There is a growing movement around the European Union as well to begin sending refugees back to Syria. Denmark is one of the countries that has started to revoke residency permits of Syrian refugees that they took in 2015. You know, if you now think back, they've lived there for 6 years, these people. They've got lives and have established roots. But the Danish government has decided that the country is safe enough now to send refugees back to. It should be noted that Denmark doesn't currently have an embassy in Syria because it doesn't consider it safe enough to have Danish officials in Syria, and both the EU and UN have said that it's not stable enough to be considered safe for returnees. So the context of this is actually a wider growing movement to begin sending these people back who were offered a hand in 2015 as part of what many governments were willing to trumpet as a very humanitarian refugee policy. It's more acute in Turkey because, as Julia says, the same protections that the EU affords to refugees aren't extended in Turkey. But it is a growing movement, and there is a growing movement towards this suggestion that actually these people have overstayed their welcome in countries that were quite happy to celebrate them 6 years ago.
Yeah, I suppose just a final point on this, Abdul, and you can speak to this from your personal experience. Do you think it's almost as if sometimes people expect refugees to continually stay impoverished and on the run and don't like it if they are actually able to better themselves when they seek asylum? I mean, it's if the woman was right and she sees Syrians who can afford bananas and she can't, why shouldn't they buy bananas if, as you say, they might have a university degree? That's not part of the deal. You know, you get asylum, but you're not allowed to better yourselves in the course of 6 years.
Well, the sentiment is that you're taking our spot. This is our job. This is our thing. My brother is an engineer, and I remember once his neighbor told him, "I want to ask you a question, but please don't take it personal. Do you think it's fair that you're an engineer and you make this money and I don't make this money?" And he looked at it and said, "But mate, you're not an engineer. You don't know how to do my job, right?" The guy was just doing just a regular job. So when we arrive, a lot of people think that refugees, are poor, cannot have a cell phone. They don't know that we come, some of us are poor. Yes, a lot of us are poor. But when we arrive somewhere, we start building our lives. We start trying to get back to education, try to find a job. And then once we found a job, then we're paying exactly the same taxes as people. And if business is good and we're successful, then we help the economy as well, paying taxes. We're not allowed to buy property in Turkey. Syrians are not allowed. But in the UK, for example, going out, spending money, and doing all these things. As you said, it's not a thing that people think that refugees should always be poor, and we always should look at them as they're guests in here, and they're good migrants, should be thankful for us. And after some time, they're going to go back, not realizing that there's no going back. There are still more Syrians going to the EU now. We know the crisis between Belarus and Poland now, flocking a lot of refugees from Syria and from Iraq flying to Belarus because Belarus decided that, hey, why don't you come to our country? We don't require a visa and we can pressure the EU with you guys. So this is not going anywhere if countries don't step up and do something about it.
Indeed. Julia, I'm coming to you next after this. All right, Julia, you're finishing the show this week. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Could doctors be told where they have to work?
Health disparities in our society, whether they are regional, racial, or socio-economic, they have deepened under COVID. That's why one of my first visits as health secretary was to Blackpool. I remember one of the nurses there. She told me that, you can trace back the entrenched health problems in Blackpool going back over a century. Let me ask you this. Do you know what the healthy life expectancy gap is between Blackpool and Richmond upon Thames? It's almost 20 years. It's time to level up on health. The state was needed in this pandemic more than any time in peacetime.
Health Secretary Sajid Javid speaking at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester last month. Julia, what's the story?
So this week, recommendations have been made by the Social Market Foundation think tank about how to improve general practice across the UK. One idea that ministers are said to be quite keen on is telling GPs that they can't work in affluent areas that are already have too many GPs there. So the idea being that in doing so, more GPs would be working in deprived areas where the health situation is more extreme and their services are needed more greatly.
So when you qualify, to take the example that the Health Secretary just said there, and you want to work in Richmond, the government says, no, you have to work in Blackpool.
Well, and that's why I'm wondering how it's going to work, because obviously GPs aren't directly employed by the government. So it's unclear who exactly would say, no, you can't. But in principle, exactly that. You couldn't just say, I would like to set up home in Bristol and that's where I'm heading. It would be very much dictated by kind of the needs of different patients across the country.
I mean, before we have the sort of obvious debate about this, Joe, how seriously do you think it is being taken? As Julia said, it's a report by the public policy think tank Social Market Foundation. So this isn't a government proposal. It doesn't seem like the kind of thing that the Tories would actually put in an election manifesto. So is it just kicking an idea about to see how far they can go? Because obviously levelling up is a big agenda for them.
Yeah, and I think that the failure of the government to articulate a sort of specific notion of what the levelling up agenda is has meant that the vacuum has been filled by think tanks pushing out lots of reports into what it maybe should or could be. It should be said that actually a body like the one that would be required to do this type of work did exist actually in the UK until about 20 years ago. It was called the Medical Practices Committee, and it had the power basically to refuse applications for GPs to work in areas that were, in the words of this body, adequately doctored. At the moment, the NHS is using £20,000 bonuses to encourage new GPs to move to areas that do have doctor shortages. You know, the Medical Practice Committee was abolished because Tony Blair and his health minister at the time considered it to be unnecessary. Reintroducing it is perfectly possible, could be done through a change in the law. It's not a completely impossible thing to do. Whether or not it's a thing that's actually being knocked around in the sort of top echelons of government, I'm not so sure.
You do wonder as well, Abdul, when we're talking about a massive gap in life expectancy in these areas that are adequately doctored and under-doctored, whether doctors really are just the answer in and of themselves. There's surely a message around education, and you've got to look at levels of poverty too.
You got to look at levels of poverty and maybe promoting a better lifestyle and, healthier eating. In England nowadays, if you want to go and have a very unhealthy meal from KFC or McDonald's, it only costs you, £5? Or if you want to have salad, what is it, £15? Or a side of avocado, £13 at least in London. So these are the options that people don't really have. It's not only about doctors. And I remember back in 2016, there was an article published by the BBC that said that at least 1 in 10 doctors will leave London. And the most affected councils were Kensington, Chelsea, and Barnet. And as far as I know, I'm not a Londoner, but these are the most expensive and richest councils. So I'm not really sure where these people go. But at the end of the day, as they say in America, keep the government out of my bedroom. These are my God-given rights. People should be able to work wherever they want.
But people should also be able to see a doctor wherever they want, shouldn't they, Julia? And it is the government's business, since we have the NHS, to ensure that the levels are roughly equal around the country.
Yeah, I think it is obviously important. And what's going to be difficult is, at the moment, given the kind of ongoing rows between the health secretary and GPs, is that this is sounding very stick, no carrot. Obviously, the £20,000 bonuses that are being offered, very carrot. But in terms of, if we're looking at, GP practices really benefit from having GPs who are going to serve them for a very long time, really building those relationships. So also we need to make those areas that are deprived attractive to GPs so that they themselves will also want to stay and have children. And that speaks to the kind of wider infrastructural issues that Abdul was just speaking about of, we need schools with more funding. There needs to be more kind of research and action on crime rates, unemployment. At the end of the day, a GP can't prescribe a job or pay a heating bill. Their job is very much about they don't do the preventative health work. It's more about kind of diagnosis and then coming up with solutions. But really, if those issues can be alleviated before they occur, it would massively help, especially for the Tories in terms of levelling up. That's what they need to be looking at, really.
But to be fair, Joe, I mean, as much as we understand what levelling up means, that is the kind of thing they're going to be looking at, isn't it? Otherwise, it is a pointless exercise.
No, quite right. And there has been some progress in attracting more trainees into sort of general practice medicine by setting up new medical schools in bits of the country where there weren't medical schools before. So Lincoln is an example, Sunderland, I think, is another one. And that has worked in terms of getting newly qualified doctors into areas like that. It should be said there's another problem here, which is going to set up a very delicate and awkward confrontation for the government, which is that, frankly, GPs aren't working as long as they used to. A survey commissioned by the Department of Health prior to the pandemic found that the average GP was working a 3-day week. In the meantime, earnings have risen. Average GPs now earn about £100,000 before tax and expenses. You know, when you're then having conversation about how difficult it is for patients to get a face-to-face appointment, apparently now around 57.7% of appointments are now in person. It was 80% before the pandemic, and that's obviously a change in the way that people work and the way that people have booked appointments. This is kind of an unsustainable system. You can't have GPs working 3 days a week and then ask questions about why people are struggling to get face-to-face consultations. That is going to set up a really awkward clash with the government, because the government is not going to want to be seen to be kicking the heroes of the pandemic and telling them all to work longer. I think Sajid Javid's got an issue here, because he is going to have to provide some carrot, as Julie has just said, because otherwise it is going to look as if he's going to war with the people that have seen us through the last 2 years. And I don't think that's a particularly great look for a government that's trying to appeal to this sense of levelling up. I don't think he's going to want to look as if he's going into battle with general practitioners, NHS staff, these kinds of people.
How does this look from overseas, Abdul, when you look at Britain and our very peculiar relationship with our health service? You know, it's sacrosanct. It's the thing every political party has to save. GPs are right up there with the nurses that got us through the pandemic. But at the same time, you know, the Daily Mail, not known for not having their finger on the populist pulse, will say we need to have more face-to-face appointments. We need to be able to see our doctors more regularly. It's a farce. Can you hold both opinions in your head at the same time?
No, not at all. But we look at who was in charge. So since, you know, for the past 10 years, the Tories were in charge. And back in 2015, Cameron said that we will have 5,000 more GPs every year. Where was that? I think people just have a goldfish memory and forget about it. Here in Hong Kong, I'm teaching, this year I'm teaching the nursing students, nursing and business students. And the nursing students, they want to finish their studies in Hong Kong and leave. They don't want to go to the UK. They said it's too cold, and a lot of nurses live on food bank. So a lot of them prefer to go somewhere else, to sunny Australia or to New York. I don't know what the situation is like there, but we have this reputation that we underpay our staff, underpay our heroes, as Joe said. So from the outside, it doesn't really look that well.
Yeah, and that potentially is an issue as well with GPs qualifying in Britain, isn't it, Julia? That even if they did their 2 years in Blackpool or whatever they had to do to pay back their loans, they would then go to Australia rather than, you know, having a surgery that they wanted in the southeast in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe not even as far as Australia. You know, if we have people who are training and wanted to go into the NHS, there's no reason for them not to then go into private healthcare instead if they decide that actually that offers them the lifestyle that they prefer. So I think that also is a big issue that needs to be considered.
So what do we think is actually going to happen on this? Joe, as we said, this is from a think tank. It isn't from the government. As Abdul said, similar promises have been made before. Where do you think we're actually going to stand?
Yeah, and as I said earlier, it could just be another case of think tanks rushing in to fill the gap that has been produced by a lack of ability to articulate what the levelling up agenda is. As I mentioned, there is a legislative way to go about this. They could reintroduce something akin to the Medical Practices Committee. They could then turn around and say, this is all New Labour's fault and they shouldn't have abolished it in the first place, and we could have distributed doctors more fairly around the country had we have had it all this time. Maybe they will do that, maybe they won't do that. It's quite hard to tell. You can see it being quite an attractive thing to potentially shove in a manifesto, I guess, if you were trying to put some flesh on the bones of the levelling up agenda.
And then you wouldn't have to have responsibility for it, would you, if you re-established a committee whose actual decision it was?
Quite, and that would be a very good way for the government to get away with actually not having to get their hands dirty in terms of actually redistributing GPs around the country.
Well, there you are, Mr. Javid. We've brainstormed it all for you. Well, like a hard-pressed GP desperate to keep my time slots in place, I must now briskly open the door and usher you back to the surly receptionist. That is it for today. My thanks to all our guests. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, then please now tap go to podcast, then tap follow. Thanks. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.